In this video tutorial, we will complete our overview of the session editor with a review of macros. So far, we have learned about the individual counter and toggle controls that are part of SuiteCG MultiSport Scoreboard. But all of those controls require a lot of clicking. The solution is to use macros. Macros allow us to execute changes to multiple counters and toggles from a single button. SuiteCG MultiSport Scoreboard provides 20 macro buttons. They are presented from left to right in 2 rows of 10. If we close the session editor, we see in the generic user interface these same buttons presented in 4 rows of 5 buttons, also listed left to right, top to bottom. In other sport types, the macro buttons are distributed throughout the user interface in a more intuitive manner. Let's return to the session editor and select the first macro. In the macro editor, we can give the macro a name, including dynamic values as we discussed with counters and toggles. We can also require a confirmation prompt. Let's set this to true and give it a temporary confirmation message. Now we'll close the session editor. When we click on the first macro, we now see the confirmation prompt. Let's return to the session editor and look at the other macro settings. We can control all 13 counters. Each counter has a selection box for choosing an action. Leaving the selection blank will cause the macro to skip this counter. An equal sign will set the counter to whatever value you place here. Let's leave it blank and set the confirmation prompt to false. Close out of the session editor and execute the macro. A large, touchscreen-friendly keypad appears, prompting us to enter a value to replace the counter's current value. Let's go back to the session editor again and edit the macro further. The plus and minus actions will perform addition or subtraction to the counter's current value. Here we have a +1 action, but we could put +2, -3, or any number we want. Let's set it to the add action, but leave the value blank. Now let's leave the session editor and execute the macro. The keypad appears, prompting us to enter a value to add to the counter's current value. If we had included an integer in the macro, this keypad prompt would be skipped and the number added automatically. Let's click the macro again. If your macro is such that you usually add to this counter, but sometimes need to subtract, a +- button is provided to add the subtraction sign. If we had selected the subtract action for this counter, the minus sign would be automatically inserted for us when the keypad prompt appeared. Let's go back to the session editor one last time to look at the macro editor's toggle actions. As with counters, if a toggle action is blank, it will be ignored. We can set a toggle to true, to false, or have it change state. Let's set toggle 1 to true, toggle 2 to false, and toggle 3 to change. Now let's close out of the macro editor. Before we close the session editor, let's change the toggle 2 and 3 timers to 0. Now let's close the session editor and see what we have. The macro still prompts us to enter a value to add to the visiting team's score. After we do that, the toggles will execute their actions. Toggle 1 is true for 5 seconds. Toggle 2 doesn't appear to have done anything, since it was already in a false state. And toggle 3 has changed states to be true. Let's set toggle 2 to true manually, then execute the macro again. As before, toggle 1 is true for 5 seconds. Toggle 2 has been set back to false, and toggle 3 has changed back to false since its previous state was true. Be advised that if a toggle is configured for data automation, macro actions for that toggle will be ignored. This concludes the 7th part of our video tutorial series on session and template files. In the next video, we will discuss saving your modified session as a new template.